So as part of the Municipal Services Project, we wanted to look at also very concrete, inspiring examples of workers working with communities to defend public water. And we started looking at some cases in Latin America. Susan Spronk and Marcela Oliveira, who contributed to this paper, had already done a big overview of what was going on in Latin America in terms of alternatives to privatization. And they had identified a best practice in Colombia, a very specific case. So we decided to do some sort of small pilot study of how this labor community alliance had evolved over time, how it was built, and you know, why it was so successful, and how community members and the unionists measured that success. So Marcela Oliveira is part of Red Vida. It's a regional water network that's present across Latin America. So she had been part of the research to identify those best practices. So basically we had two unions working with one small community close to Cali, one of the main cities in Colombia. One of those unions was Sintraqua Valle, the union of the Workers' Union of Aqua Valle, which is a public water utility that provides services in the rural areas outside of the capital city in Valle del Cauca. I'll show you a map afterwards. And we had a second union collaborating, Sintra. So they're the workers from CVC, it's the Regional Environmental Authority. So we had two public entities working together with this specific community. So I went to Colombia last fall, the Canadian fall. So I spent 3 months there. I conducted a series of background interviews with people who had been active in the national water movement, and then did field work over 5 weeks. It was an action research project, so we sat down with both the community leaders and the union leaders who had been part of the initiative, so that they could help us design the research agenda, decide on relevant field visits to make, and then decide on a composition for focus groups and things like that. And just before I left, we organized the final workshop where we invited 2 other community aqueducts who were in the process of sealing similar agreements with the union. So they would talk to the community aqueduct in La Sirena to hear about their own experience. And because Aqua Valle works in rural areas, as I explained, they cover a huge territory. So there was no way those aqueducts could meet otherwise. So just maybe a bit of background. So Colombia, just as the rest of Latin America, saw a wave of privatizations in the 80s and 90s. In the case of Colombia, privatization was put on the agenda in 1991 with the constitutional reform, when they abolished the monopoly over public service utilities. And then in 1994, they adopted the private services law, and that's when a lot of multinationals entered the market in Colombia. And today, there is about 20% of water utilities in Colombia that are private, whereas early in the early 90s, it was entirely owned by the state. So to continue, so we had all those multinationals enter the market. The biggest cities, Bogota and Medellin, kept their public providers, although these have been working mostly based on market-based principles. Some of you may have seen Marcela Lopez's presentation yesterday on the situation in Medellin. And then in Valle del Cauca, the region that's close to Cali, I don't know if you see on the left, it's close to the Pacific coast. So in that region, workers resisted privatization over 20 years. So in the city of Cali itself, Cali has been, well, the department has been wanting to privatize this utility for 20 years, and there's this epic story of workers resisting privatization, and there are very good articles about that by Novelli. Maybe Adrian, you can provide some more detail on that later. And then we had also Sintra Valle, who's the rural water provider, resist privatization as well. Their situation has been very difficult because there was some corruption within Aqua Valle, and their financial situation was terrible. So yeah, it was very hard for them to find any backing. So that's why I think they started to engage communities and to try and show that they were really trying to do something for the public to kind of counter this image of a corrupted public utility. So today, just to let you know, in Colombia, it's one of the countries in Latin America that has the most freshwater resources, but there's still 30% of people who don't have access to water. And scarcity mostly affects the rural areas, so the areas where Aqua Valle works, and that's also where a quarter of the population lives. So the water movement has been very active throughout the last 15 years. There was a big referendum campaign that was launched in 2005 on the right to water. They were able to collect over 2 million signatures, but they failed their demands, which is buried by Congress. But through that referendum, they were able to build a very strong coalition of unionists, activists, people working on environmental issues, and that helped them build a consensus that's still very much alive today. So the key demands from the referendum campaign, when I was doing all the background interviews, we can still hear people saying, we want a minimum amount of free water for everybody, we want public management of the resource, and we want special protection for the ecosystems that are key to the water cycle. So these demands are still very much alive. And then water activists also pushed public-public partnerships. I don't know if some of you saw this session yesterday, but basically trying to push some public service providers to work with other public service providers to help them improve the services. And in Colombia in particular, the water activists have really been pushing, while defending the small traditional water systems in the rural areas, in the mountains, those systems that have been built over 30 years and that are now under threat just because they have to comply with national regulations that were really designed for enterprises, big companies. So for example, big challenges they face in the community aqueducts is to have the right, have a water quality that complies with the regulations, and then financial sustainability, because they work with people who can't really afford water. So it's been very difficult for them to actually recover their costs. So maybe I can just mention that Aqua Valle, the public water provider I'm talking about, has made a public partnership with CDC. So I mentioned that the regional environmental authority was working with Aqua Valle. That's because to prevent privatization of Aqua Valle in 2005, Aqua Valle had to give some of its shares to CDC. That was the only way to stave off privatization. And since then, Centrovalle and Centroambiente have come much closer because they are now working together on a regular basis. And now Aquavalle serves 150,000 users across the territory. I explained it was very dispersed. You know, you can see it's a huge territory. It's 78% of the territory of the whole Valle del Cauca region, but it's only 14% of the actual population of that region. So they're serving not that many users, but over a huge territory. And of course, it's very expensive to bring water to those rural communities. And most of their users are from the lower two quintals. So, you know, it's been very difficult for them to comply with the regulations and to recover costs just because there's no cross-subsidy, almost none. Okay, let me go quickly. So community aqueducts, I mentioned, have been praised as, you know, a very good alternative in rural areas. And there are over 10,000 such community aqueducts in Colombia today. And they provide services to 40% of people in rural areas. So we look at the case of La Sirena. Maybe I could give you a background of the community later on in the discussion. But basically, this is a community that grew over 40 years. They started by invading the property of a big landowner in the outskirts of Cali. And then, you know, once the population, it was initially 20 families, and, you know, within 10 years it was 1,300 people, and they started building their own water system with initial public investment in the community aqueduct, but then they were left to manage it on their own with no support. So maybe I can just mention that now La Sirena is really a very urban area. Cali is kind of sprawled and is very close to La Sirena. Okay, let me jump. So basically, it was a very long process for the labor to engage, the two labor unions to engage with the community. They made first contact in 2008, and it took 2 full years before the community agreed to sit down with them and to see, okay, let's work together. You know, you only have good intentions, let's do this. Because there's deep distress in unions in Colombia and a lot of those communities because of a lot of corruption and all of that. And then after 2 years, they were able to sit down and agree on specific goals. The community kind of said, okay, this is what we need, this is what we want to do. And then once those goals were put down on paper, you know, they were able to achieve the objectives very quickly. So in less than a year, they had achieved all the objectives. So we had workers coming in, so you see Wilson at the right, to redo the network plans, the whole plans for the water network so they could comply with national regulation. We had Wilmer, who's at the bottom, who helped them learn how to detect leaks and monitor their system a bit better. And then he went to the community to help them repair those damages and show them how to do it so they could do it afterwards on their own, you know, without needing his help. And all of that was done on a volunteer basis. Some of those people just went and spent the weekends with the community, and so, you know, they really demonstrated their engagement and commitment to making water services better in those communities. A big part of what they did also was trying to improve admin stuff. So basically capacitation on norms to make sure they understood what they had to comply with. Due to the new regulations, they have to meter water, so they helped them improve that. They helped them improve the billing system, because you had a lot of small users who were actually subsidizing the bigger users, so they introduced a fixed rate so that wouldn't happen anymore. and then a series of financial management tools. And what you see here is just when we did the focus groups, you know, those people kind of discussed and decided, okay, well, for us, this was the most important. These were the most important things we achieved. And in terms of working on the environmental front with Centrambiente, they did a series of field visits to the watersheds to identify the contamination factors. So there was illegal mining, deforestation, and a lot of other issues. And then they had a series of workshops to increase awareness within the community to make sure, you know, people knew about the whole water cycle, because a lot of people just saw water, you know, once it was coming out of the tap and didn't think about the whole, you know, treatment of the water, and then, you know, the importance of the ecosystems and all of that. And the board members, who are elected board members managing the aqueduct, were capacitated to monitor the watersheds so they could become allies of the regional environmental authorities, so they could report violations and seek redress. And then they've made plans to have a plant nurturing the area to restore the watershed. And they've been working now with 3 other community aqueducts, neighboring aqueducts, to take care of the watershed together, because they all rely on it. So they can't be working separately. They have to work together if this is going to make a difference. Yeah, you mentioned during your presentation, you know, the key principles or ideas or feelings that people had, you know, following this collaboration, and I think it's very similar, you know, in working with the union and sitting down and spending time with them, you know, I think that all of this distrust, Margarita Lopez, who's the president of Aqua Valle, Sintra Aqua Valle, she was saying, you know, I think we changed the whole paradigm. So, you know, initially they didn't even want to sit with the unions, and now, you know, they go and have food together and have lunch, and they're just friends, right? So yeah, I think I'm done now, but I can maybe talk about some of the challenges later during the questions period.